What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Web3 with a Splash of Wine podcast, where we talk about blockchain technology, DeFi, NFTs, and all kinds of other Web3 vibes. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and nothing said on the podcast should be taken as financial or legal advice. Let's dive into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 with a Splash of Lime podcast. I'm your host Z, part of LimeChain, founder of FIAT DAO, and today I have Max Fiege from Fiat DAO. Max is one of the most knowledgeable people, in my opinion, in the DeFi space, and he's one of the founders and builders of Fiat DAO. And today we're going to basically geek out about everything DeFi, fixed income, and more nerdy stuff like that. Welcome to the show, Max.
Thanks for having me, Ziv.
Nice. Let's start with a quick intro. Like, what's your background and how did you get into this crazy world of Web3 and crypto?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, I was on pace to be, I would say, kind of like policy analyst out in Washington, D.C. And I was at a think tank when the 2017 bull run hit. And so essentially, as kind of like the intern there, I got tasked with doing like blockchain research, even though I was there more for like renewable energy work. And with all that done, like December 2017 rolled around, I was super hyped on crypto and bought a couple altcoin tops and very quickly became a researcher and in it for the tech just a month or two later. And so I spent kind of the period between 2018 and 2020 just focusing on specific parts of crypto where I could provide commentary and do research. I was focused mainly on kind of like Bitcoin mining, just because like the energy side there. But in 2018, I got the chance to meet the SEP protocol guys, who were one of the first kind of like DeFi native teams in crypto, in my opinion. And that really kind of turned me on to what was being built at the time, right? Like very early days of DeFi, where it was like Kyber and Bancor and then Maker and then finally Uniswap and so on. And so while I did spend about a little over a year at a financial firm in 2020, for 2020, there we go. I finally made the jump to DeFi proper about a year ago now when I started working for BarnBridge. So my background is not technical, but it has kind of been focused at this intersection of, like finance or macroeconomics and how it kind of intersects with various technology aspects. So I've always kind of been drawn to DeFi because of the type of utility it adds on top of crypto, and now have been in the space for a year as a builder.
Nice. That's awesome. And I definitely feel your pain with buying the altcoin tops in 2017. Fun times. Awesome. Like, I like how you also kind of briefly described the progress of the DeFi space. Like initially, like obviously we're oversimplifying it, but it all started out with some of the protocols you mentioned. Like the first big use cases were lending and like this or peer-to-peer exchanges of assets like Uniswap and stuff like that. And over the past, I guess, 1 or 2 years, with like maybe 2 years now, summer we're starting to we're seeing new primitives progressively into the space, like insurance, income instruments, like some of the products of BarnBridge, notional yield, what have you. And now we're having like even like more interesting and complicated primitives like protocol on liquidity, like all this narrative around DeFi 2.0, even if I don't like this particular term. I think it's just like a bunch of new primitives entering the space. From your experience and perspective, how would you describe the current landscape of DeFi or the DeFi space, and what trends do you see going forward?
Yeah. So I would say our view, especially at Fiat, just because we're kind of more at the cutting edge that you kind of outlined there, is that there's been obviously a ton of adoption on kind of what I would call like cash markets, meaning that when you're talking about spot crypto assets, right? Like it's relatively straightforward these days to get secondary liquidity and even kind of like lending market liquidity now that you have like long tail providers like Rari or Sushi's solution as well. But that's kind of where things have stalled out at, right? Like people are finding new ways to get yield on specific spot assets, but making that next jump to maybe more complex systems, I think has been a bit delayed, right? And in part, we're trying to solve that at Fiat. Like that's kind of our MO is trying to figure out how we can recreate the experience DeFi users have today with spot assets on dexes and on lending markets, but for things that are, locked versions of those spot assets, for example. That's kind of like our first, right? And so I think, now that we are in a bear market period and the noise has quieted down a bit, I think what I'm most interested to kind of see develop is, will this like next wave of DeFi, presuming we exist in a year. It's always a big question in
Yeah.
crypto, right? I would imagine it has to come from more complex financial applications. Like I don't think we'll be able to recreate the 100th Dex yield farm a
Yeah.
year from now, right? Like it's going to have to be like actual productive financial use cases and actual yields, not just like incentives that are presented as yield. Because otherwise, I think we've already plateaued in terms of DeFi innovation, and it really kind of behooves the space to think forward at this point in time, because I do think it is a kind of a critical juncture for like us all getting taken seriously.
Definitely, and I'm with you here. I just have, I think, a follow-up question to that. Um, Definitely agree that hopefully, we're going to see more and more, like I would say, more sophisticated financial instruments on the blockchain. Who do you think ends up with those? And the reason that I'm asking this is a DEX is an easy to use for regular DGen that has low to mid financial literacy. But some of those more complex products, and you guys are building something in that realm as well. Who do you think ends up as the main user of that in terms of, is it institutions or like more educated retail investors, or do you think we can actually educate even not so DeFi power users or like not so financially literate people to use those?
Yeah, I would say kind of like the main determining factor on this, because I do think it is path dependent, is just the reality of gas costs and what those applications in particular are actually deployed on. So, one example I can give, because we deal in fixed income at Fiat, is that, the gas costs associated with maybe creating and managing positions eats away into yield, right? And so
Yep.
that's been solved by teams like Yearn Finance, where they've aggregated assets to minimize the impact gas has on yield. But I think smaller players in these markets are definitely kind of at the mercy of gas. And so if a specific more complex DeFi application is not on a gas-friendly chain, I do think, stablecoin funds, whales, DAO treasuries become the primary users of these more sophisticated instruments. That being said, though, if scaling solutions, whether that means an app can be deployed across EVM chains with lower gas costs, or it means optimistic and ZK rollups really start garnering more and more adoption. I would say I'm confident in the ability for people to learn what is going on. Like I think crypto has a very unique inherent incentivization mechanism, right? Like if you learn how to do something that's hard in crypto, more often than not, you are rewarded for it. And so that's kind of like my personal view. I think, it doesn't matter if you're financially literate at the onset. Like I think a well-documented project and a dynamic community can really teach people a lot, especially if they feel like there's something at the end for them, if they, learn to use things. Maybe it is double-digit fixed income on their savings account for
Yeah,
savings example.
that's a good point. I mean, there are some primitives in the DeFi space that haven't existed into the even in TradFi, and people got quite accustomed to that, like liquidity mining or and stuff like that. So it's not that complex per se, but it's still something that didn't exist, and people got um, basically called up on it really quickly. So it's a good point, and I agree. Cool. So let's dive straight into fiat then. We mentioned fixed income a bit, a few times now. What are you guys building there in Fiat DAO? And is the product live? When is it going out? Stuff like that.
Sure. So I can give a bit of context
Mm-hmm.
as well. I'm one of four co-founders, and
Mm-hmm.
all four of us had worked previously at Barnbridge, which had a fixed income solution launched about a year ago now. And we noticed that there wasn't material adoption of that product. And also realized that other issuers of fixed income assets were kind of struggling to get material product market fit as well. Last I checked, around like 2.5% of lending market TVL is in fixed income protocols today. So it's very much not like kind of how TradFi markets are, where fixed
Yeah.
income is like the dominant variant. And so we spent most of the summer of 2021 thinking about how to solve kind of like this demand issue. And there's a vast number of differences between TradFi and DeFi on this topic, but the main one that stood out to us is that in TradFi, assets like bonds, for example, are viewed as relatively pristine collateral, outside of you being like a Russian bank that gets sanctioned, right? Like obviously there's like exceptions to
Yeah.
the rule, but by and large, especially if you're talking like U.S. Treasuries, you can get a very high LTV to borrow against those positions. And now if you think about the DeFi experience, if you take on a fixed income position from Barnbridge, Notional, or Element, you really don't have anywhere you can borrow against that effectively, and at a kind of like adjusted cost as well, because like you don't want to eat away at all your yield with your borrowing costs. And then a kind of a second order issue was also in the case of Barnbridge, there wasn't really a path forward for liquid secondary markets. Notional and Finance have kind of addressed that problem to date, but if you think about a larger universe of fixed income assets that could exist, there will probably be ones that aren't super liquid. And so that was kind of like a secondary issue. And with all of that in mind, we realized there was really an opportunity here for a solution that could offer leverage on fixed income assets at a very like foundational level. And with that in mind, we kind of had two questions, right? The first was, does that get built inside of Barnbridge? And the second was, do existing protocols have the ability to maybe offer that solution? And so I can tackle that second question first. And so when we think about, where can I borrow in DeFi today? There's two main kind of avenues, right? One is you're able to mint stable coins against certain protocols like DAI or like MakerDAO or Liquidity. And so that's a form of credit that is extended to you. And on the other side, you have markets like Aave and Compound, where you're able to borrow assets that had been lent to the protocol by other users. And so if we think about peer-to-peer lending markets, or I guess peer-to-pool lending markets, the main issue there is, if I lock in 4 to 6% on a fixed income position, I don't want to pay 4% to borrow cash against that position. It eats up all my yield. And so that means if Aave or Compound were to support a longer tail of assets, or you think of solutions like Silo and Euler, the question becomes, well, like, who wants to lend their stables against these collateral types for 1% a year, 2% a year? It just doesn't really add up that well, in my opinion, or would require a ton of subsidization with governance tokens, for example. So that kind of ruled those ones out in our opinion. And then we kind of thought, okay, well, why can't MakerDAO do this at scale? And that's a bit more of a nuanced kind of discussion, I would say, right? Like MakerDAO could indeed onboard some amount of bonds and fixed income collateral, and already has, right? Like with real world assets to mint DAI against it. But the reality is that there is a certain threshold at which they couldn't accept more fixed income assets, right? Because they've committed to a peg that is in part enforced by liquidation auctions. And if you can't dump a bond to liquidate its debt, then it just puts their peg at risk. That's kind of like the primary issue in theory. And then the secondary one is, would MakerDAO want to mint DAI against bonds denominated in competitor stablecoins? And would it be an issue for MakerDAO to issue DAI against bonds denominated in DAI? Right? It gets a little messy. It could work, but it's not quite a universal solution, and it does have certain ceilings to it. So with all that in mind, right, we did think there was an opportunity to create a product here, and our opinion was that it should exist independent of any one fixed income asset issuer, for similar reasons as I highlighted with like MakerDAO and against other stablecoins, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how Fiat DAO has been born. We've been working on it since October, and to put it simply, Fiat is a lending market solution for fixed income assets initially, and hopefully a longer tail of illiquid derivatives in general. The V1 that has been built and we're looking to put into production this month is based heavily off of MakerDAO's framework. So users will be able to bring supported collateral types to the system and mint fiat against it as a stable value asset, meaning we target $1, but recognize that there could be moments in time where it deviates from $1 just because the collateral backing it is illiquid, and that results in kind of periods of volatility potentially. And with that in place, our hope is that users will be able to mint fiat, have secondary liquidity for it, and actually start re-leveraging their fixed income positions such that the yields offered by fixed income protocols become attractive, and that these kind of lending markets or solutions and fixed income solutions in general actually help drive down financing costs across DeFi, making other use cases more feasible on top of them.
Awesome. Appreciate the context in the beginning. I think it was super useful for everyone to understand basically what you guys are building. And to put it simply, you're enabling people to basically use their fixed leverage and then put that leverage to work. So I guess this ties into the concept of not concept, basically there's this meme of money Legos that DeFi has been compared to. And I love also one of the slogans that you guys have on your website, which says that fixed income should be not the end of your journey, but basically just the start that you can use then for other financial instruments. And I guess this is pretty much what Money Legos is about. You mentioned V1 coming out this month and what it is going to provide, basically look like. What do you guys have in mind for the future roadmap going forward? Do you see us basically integrating more assets in terms of like fixed income protocols, or do you have more sophisticated primitives in mind?
Yeah. So the initial rollout will support platforms like Notional and
Mm-hmm.
Element Finance, as well as Barnbridge and Yield Protocol in particular. And those are all platforms that are kind of stablecoin denominated for the assets in question, and which are over collateralized. Meaning these are like the safest assets we could come
Yeah.
to support. And so the focus of subsequent development is going to look into how can we start supporting fixed income assets that are denominated in volatile assets, and on a longer time frame, that may even be under collateralized, right? Like maybe a DAO issuing a bond in the future, right? Like that's kind of like the end game for a lot for DeFi, in my
Yeah.
opinion, at least. And to make this concrete, right? Like I think what our focus will be on top of this version 1 of the protocol is to actually add a kind of second layer of functionality to it, meaning that I previously gave an example of how MakerDAO and Aave represent kind of like two ways of building out a lending market to some extent, right? And our view is that there's an opportunity here to fuse kind of the two. So our medium-term kind of focus will be on developing what we would call like liquidity buffers in the system, meaning that you'd have people kind of collateralizing fixed income positions to mint fiat against, but we'd also be interested in having people lend cash to the system. So just bringing USDC, DAI, and so on, kind of like the underlying assets of that collateral we accept, and actually lending it to the protocol itself, such that when we have those types of liquidation auctions, there's actually an ability for us to incentivize people to participate in liquidation auctions. An example of that would be, maybe someone minted 95 fiat against a position that yields 105 USDC. And for whatever reason, interest rates went really high and now the collateral is worth less. We may need to liquidate that position and essentially get our 95 fiat back at the protocol level. But it could be the case that no one's interested in buying 105 locked USDC and no one brings that 95 fiat back. If we had some amount of liquid USDC to kind of throw in as a kicker or to kind of change the composition of what's being put up for liquidation, now it actually becomes a lot more likely that someone at some point finds like an equilibrium value at which they would bring that 95 back for liquidation. And so kind of like the end goal of what fiat could be, right, is the system in which we have a stable value asset and some fractional amount of liquid cash as well. And that would allow us to kind of expand to a longer tail of assets, because we would be able to kind of borrow liquidity when needed in order to liquidate bad positions. And I would say that's the medium term. But what's cool about that is like if you have like an actual lending market where some amount of liquid USDC has been lent to fiat, interest rates are being calculated that way on a per collateral basis. You can now use that data to inform things like credit default swaps or other kind of more exotic financial instruments that would actually be able to be priced. And now you can start accepting under-collateralized assets as well. It's kind of like the dream scenario, right? Like really build a protocol that just can extend to any wonky type of derivative and have measures in place to kind of assess the risk, hedge the risk, and offer credit to its holders, because I do think that then unlocks a ton of new use cases within DeFi, or at the very least kind of reduces the capital inefficiency that exists today that makes it not so attractive for people to try out those longer tail assets.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating and quite a bit of. I mean, there's endless possibilities of what you guys could build after V1. You mentioned that one of the obstacles you see to people, by people I mean DeFi users, basically exploring these more sophisticated products is gas fees. Um, would all of that you just described happen on layer one, and are you guys looking at layer twos for those?
Yeah, so because the majority of these fixed income protocols today exist on Ethereum mainnet, that is where we are deploying. So I do think
Yeah.
certain smaller users may be a bit disappointed when they load the app for the first time, just because we rely on proxy, like every user having a proxy, and then you also have to mint the other asset in the first place. So it's probably not going to be cheap to use, to be quite frank. That being said, I do think the type of user who's interested in leveraging fixed income is probably a larger one. So at the moment, in the short term, we view it as an acceptable trade-off.
Yeah.
While I am excited for layer two opportunities, I will say, not even MakerDAO has figured out a great way to mint DAI and burn DAI across chains, right? Like DAI has been bridged, but the actual app functionality is not. And so I think our view is that we're really keen on getting fiat, cross-chain as possible. But having a CDP mechanism, I still think will keep us on mainnet for the foreseeable future. To the extent that impacts adoption, I do think precedent has been set by players like Yearn Finance and StakeDAO that aggregation is a good way of combating gas fees. And so the hope would be if we are a successful protocol and it is 6 months down the road and all of a sudden ETH block space is taken up by a ton of roll-up commits and so on, we'd at least be able to kind of benefit from economies of scale and just have standardized strategies represented as vaults and go about it that way. But obviously on a long enough time frame, I do think most DeFi projects will be forced off of layer one and be forced to pick a roll-up to kind of have their governance on, especially, and just the app functionality too. So thankfully, a lot of very smart people are working on that, right? And we as a newer project hope that we can continue standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, especially on that front.
Yeah, this definitely makes sense, and I'm also sharing the same vibes about layer twos. Another question that I had to, or I wanted to ask about building Fiat DAO is something very specific which you guys have done is building all of these in a DAO first way, meaning that something that we've also done a Tenter DAO based on the shoulders of projects like Bridge that have uh, done so before that. But what has the experience of building DAO first been like for you guys, and what benefits do you think it offers in comparison to a more centralized manner of building a product?
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, I guess, by going DAO first, that means Fiat DAO exists only as an entity on Ethereum. Like there's no LLC anywhere in the world that holds Fiat DAO Labs shares or anything like that. And to date, we have been working kind of close sourced. We just open sourced the main code base as of last week. And so we're in this position where, I think a DAO grows in phases, right? In this initial
Yeah.
phase, we worked in private. Our core contributor kind of team, as well as contractors like LimeChain. And the main reasoning behind that was we were, concerned that DeFi is a very competitive space, and working on things in public for a long time before you launch does increase the risk of getting front run.
Yep.
Happened at Bridge, and so we kind of kept that in mind. And I do think there are trade-offs, right? Like if you're building privately, community is excited by your ideas, but they don't know if you're legit or not. Like it's a totally valid concern. But like I said, DAOs grow in stages, and this stage that went on for 3.5 months was private. But now that we are live with the code base and we're going to production shortly, we're really excited at the prospect of transitioning over to kind of a more open DAO. And obviously DAO is like a very nebulous term, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no there's no specific structure of what a DAO means. It purely means that there's a group of people and entities that have a shared treasury on chain and a shared kind of consensus mechanism on chain, here being like a governance token, right? But what excites us is that we've gotten such a ton of inquiries around contributing to the project, and we're now starting to onboard that talent. And I think the way we view, the value of a DAO is that it's not that it's going to be a flat organization, but it's this idea that anyone can show up. And if you really put the work in to like onboard people, you just become surprised by the amount of talent that shows up knocking at your door, in my opinion. And you give autonomy to the right people, right? Like, I think where DAOs kind of present a new way of working relative to like more traditional enterprise is that they're very lean organizations, right? I think our personal view is that we'll have some sub DAO type structure where you have working groups of people with specific mandates, and their budgets might be determined by a combination of a council and community vote, but they do retain the autonomy to just build as they see fit. And if you have appropriate checks and balances in place, I do think a DAO of 25 to 50 people can build something that services just as much capital as an organization in TradFi that requires thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, right? Like Uniswap's a good example, right? Like they have 50 employees or so, and how many billions of AUM being kind of processed there, or TVL being processed there. So that's kind of how we view the DAO experiment, so to speak, right? Like we're gradually opening up over time, and the real end goal is a kind of community or cooperative driven system in which there are leaders, but those leaders aren't necessarily just the people that have been around the longest, or they can't hide behind middle management, right? Like that's kind of like the main shortcomings, I think, of corporate structures today. And so it excites me to be working in a DAO context. Obviously, life is harder when you can't enter into legal contracts with either employees of the DAO or service providers to the DAO. But I do think kind of like just this like general concept of anyone with an internet connection being able to kind of pick up work and get to it is a very powerful building block, and I think is what gives crypto one of its main advantages, right? Because it's just so easy to start working on new projects or new functionalities within existing projects, and benefit from like a whole hive mind looking at what's going on and assessing it in real time.
For sure. And I'm also super interested to see how the whole sub-DAO narrative develops, because they have like, obviously we all love DAOs and we're contributors in a bunch of these, and we're founders in some of these and building. But if we're like honest with ourselves, there haven't been too many DAOs that have scaled successfully. I guess one of the prime examples in terms of doing it is MakerDAO, and I think they implemented the sub DAO structure with their, I think they called it core units, or if I'm not mistaken. I think they did it quite well, and quite curious to see if this is the go-to model for DAOs that live long enough to scale. So happy, not happy, but excited to see how this develops. Last question, so we don't keep this too long, and it's a more, I guess it's the most fun question, is there is something about the visual branding of Fiat DAO, which is very strongly tied to ancient Rome and Roman culture. You have wording such as for the governance module of Fiat DAO. There's the Age of Romulus, basically NFTs, and all of this. Like, how did all of this? How did you guys come up with all of this, and how is it tied into the basically what you guys are building in Fiat DAO?
Yeah, so I guess it really starts with our name, right? So
Yeah.
we went with Fiat as an acronym for Fixed Income Asset Token.
Hmm.
So we found like a funny opportunity there to make a pun.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, we were like, well, Fiat is Latin, and so there's an opportunity here to do more Roman themed
Yeah.
design work. And yeah, we just got lucky in that we had access to a really great team of designers right off the bat. And I studied Latin in high school, and we have a few other history nerds on the team.
Nice.
So we were just eager to kind of go with that theme even throughout like the code base. And yeah, I'm excited to see how that branding develops over time. And I mean, there's also the reality that we just get a lot of free marketing by calling
Oh,
ourselves
for sure.
Fiat. It's right. It's like the redacted cartel team, right? Where everyone
Yeah.
uses redacted on Twitter as like a hype mechanism, and I
Yeah.
never know if they're referring to the project or just in general. And similarly, like if I get the permission from the rest of the team to be a bit more funny with the main Twitter account, I'll definitely start retweeting like all the anti-fiat tweets in general for jokes.
Yeah. Nice. No, but I love it. I mean, I'm a kind of a geek about Roman and ancient Greek culture as well. So definitely love the basically the whole branding and visuals. And I also want to give you guys kudos for actually um, basically standing out of the crowd because you're not sticking out to like current design teams in DeFi because we have kind of like different elements or visuals that have been trendy over time and just building a cutting edge DeFi protocol with like strong Roman motifs in it. I find it quite fascinating. So kudos to you guys for that.
Definitely.
Awesome. I think that would be pretty much it for today. Really appreciate you joining the show and talking about Fiat DAO and basically the evolution of DeFi. Tell the audience where can basically people find or learn more about Fiat DAO. Obviously, Twitter or Discord. Where's the community most active, and where should they follow you guys?
Yeah. So if you go to our Twitter, which is just /Fiat DAO without any hyphens or whatever, you'll find a link tree there. And that'll take you to our Discord, our white paper, and all the existing kind of various media we have in place. And yeah, most folks are active on the Discord. And so we've been doing a public kind of community Discord, and we've also been working on a Fiat work server as well. So I think we're going to be very reliant on Discord
Yeah,
going forward. Our favorite Web 2 overlord over there.
for sure. It was hilarious. I think Discord was down yesterday and they tweeted like time to go outside.
That's what I did. I was like, oh, I can't work anymore.
Yeah,
So,
it's pretty much all the DAOs are shutting down. I'm not sure if this is going to be a problem going forward. It's definitely kind of a point of failure for communications. Having in mind it's a centralized platform, but hopefully it all goes smooth.
exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Appreciate you being on the show and happy to do one down the line once Fiat DAO has products out there and hopefully a lot of TVO.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Ziv, and super excited to see what we can do with EnerDAO too. Maybe the
For
first
sure.
metaverse mortgage gets collateralized on fiat.
This is programmed, so like it's inevitable
Exactly.
down the line.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Max.
Take care.